There's a famous story in the book of Luke that for centuries has been known as the parable of the prodigal son. It's a story about a son who takes his father's inheritance, wastes it all, and then returns to a forgiving father. But it is a great mistake to think that this is a story about just one son. It's actually a tale of two sons. It's a story about a younger brother and an elder brother. We are meant to compare and contrast them. And if we don't compare and contrast them, we miss the radical message that Jesus is leading us to. He also wants us to see ourselves in the story. He wants us to see that we need something that's missing in our lives. He wants us to long for something. He wants us to seek something. He wants us to hope for home. Jesus' purpose in telling this parable was not to give us a sentimental message. He is here to say basically this, that everything you've ever heard and everything you've ever thought about how to approach God is wrong.
How we doing? All right, doing great. For those of you new who don't know me, I'm Mark Lohman, one of the associate pastors here at New Life. And if you haven't been here before, we are starting a brand new series this morning called The Prodigal God. Not called Mark Lohman, associate pastor. That might be weird. So we're super excited, and if you've been here the last month or so, you would know that we've kind of been talking about this for a little bit, and so it's finally here. And one thing that we're doing in this series is that all of our current life groups, as well as the new ones, and there's been about 5 that have been formed, we had about 50 people sign up who weren't previously connected in a life group, which is awesome. So all of our life groups, our Indonesian ministry, our student ministry, they're meeting right now in the youth room. We are all going through this series called Prodigal God. And so it's going to be good. It is based, a little background here, it's based off of a book that a well-known pastor in New York City named Tim Keller, that was the individual speaking on the video. He wrote this book, and it's all based off of one of, if not Jesus' most famous parable, found in Luke chapter 15. And so that's what we're doing. We'll do this for the next 5 weeks. Last week, all the life groups kind of did the introduction for it. And then each Sunday morning from here to Palm Sunday, we're going to be dissecting this parable from different angles. So it's going to be good. And then Easter comes, which is crazy because I feel like we just ended Christmas. So time flies when you're having fun. Hopefully you're having fun. One other kind of background thing that I think is pretty important. One of the reasons why we chose this series is that this parable, as we'll find out, it does a really, really good job at laying out the essentials of the Christian message, what we call the gospel, which just means the good news of Jesus. And so if you are new and maybe you're not even sure about Jesus yet, you're here and you're still questioning him, you don't know what he's about, you don't know what it means to follow him, this is literally like a perfect time to be here the next 5 weeks because we are going to be looking at the heart of God, about the Father, and then maybe kind of the second main character would be, as we're going to learn, the older son. And so if I was to rename this parable and a bunch of other people, we'd probably rename it the parable of the prodigal father. And that may seem kind of weird to some of us. If you don't know what the word prodigal means, the word prodigal simply just means recklessly above and beyond. Someone who's spent everything. Someone who's just gone beyond extravagant means. I mean, one definition that I read that I love is wastefully extravagant. I mean, that's the very word, the very concept that people use to describe my car, a Toyota 2005 Corolla. Prodigal. I wanted to say that one. So I'm just gonna, what I love about Toyotas? I was talking to my sister last week. They just bought the same car that we have, and the people tell you when you buy your car and they ask you a million questions and it's really annoying. And it's like the Toyota dealership is trying to get us to buy a warranty, and I'm like, why would I ever buy a warranty from Toyota? Like, your cars last forever. But anyways, she told the sales guy that. I thought that was pretty funny. So Prodigal, that was a side tangent there. The reason why Tim Keller labels his book The Prodigal God is precisely because of this understanding of prodigal, meaning this: the father in the story represents God. And so what he's saying is that God is prodigal. God is he just spreads his lavish love upon us. And he joyfully throws parties every single time someone comes home to him and becomes into the family of God. God is a prodigal God. He lavishly, over, above, and beyond loves us. And so what we're going to find out this series is not only that the father in this parable represents God. The more alarming thing, perhaps, is that most of us in this room are the older son. Because really, there are two types of people in this world, and those same two types of people existed in the time of Jesus. So we're not even going to, sorry this is bad news, we're not even going to actually look at the parable this morning. Instead, what I want us to do is I kind of want to back up a step, and I just want to set the stage for what we're going to walk into for the next 5 weeks. And a great question to ask whenever you read the Bible is to kind of step back and to say, why is the author saying what they're saying? In this case, Jesus is speaking. And so to ask, okay, why is Jesus telling this parable? Like, what's provoking him? Because he's not just having, like random story time at your local library. What's going on here and what we're going to see is that this famous parable is actually the climax of two shorter stories that come right before it. A parable is just a story. And those two short stories that come right before it are all part of an interaction that Jesus is having with two types of people. Okay? So we're going to dive into that. If you're a Star Wars fan, we're going to turn to your favorite book in the Bible, which is the book of Luke. Who here likes Star Wars? You wanted him to put his hand down. What's up with that? You like a Star Trek fan or something? I don't know. I've never watched Star Trek. Okay, I'm a little hyper this morning. So Luke chapter 15, verse 1. If you need a free Bible, we have these right in front of you. We will be on page 729. So here's the scene set before us. Okay? Before we get to the parable of what's called the parable of the prodigal son, here's the scene leading up to that. Verse 1, here's what we read. Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And for now, let's stop there. So remember, I said there's two types of people. Not only in the first century world, the time of Jesus with this parable, as well as there's two types of people that Jesus interacts with today. Here they are. First type, tax collectors and sinners. Second type, Pharisees, religious leaders, teachers of the law. Some translations will call them scribes. That is your second type of people. Now, most of us here do not like the IRS. Anybody here like the IRS? Well, actually, before I go any further, does anybody here work for the IRS? Right? I gotta watch what I say, I guess. It's tax season, right? So, just as you don't like the IRS, they hated tax collectors. That actually would be an understatement. They despised tax collectors. Tax collectors, not only would they collect your taxes, which were a huge amount of money, and so obviously that's annoying, and we don't like that, just like today. But tax collectors in the ancient world, they would slap a huge fee on top of what you're already paying just for themselves. It was entirely unfair, it wasn't cool, and people hated them, and they knew it. They were scumbags, as my mom would say. Okay? Oh, let me ask one other question. Does anybody here work for H&R Block or Jackson Hewitt or anything? Okay. Met with our tax lady last week, and I started getting these feelings, just like I feel like these tax collectors here, okay? It's just not good, people. So tax collectors are lumped in the same category as sinners. Second word that Jesus used for the first type. Now, sinners, it's a very churchy word. It had a slightly different connotation back then. A sinner back then meant someone who was kind of a social outcast, and the reason why they were discarded on the margins of society was that they did not, for all intents and purposes, they did not obey strictly the Jewish law book. And so this could mean that they ate unclean food, or they were around unclean animals. The list goes on. And so society, the Jewish people labeled them a sinner, and they were outcasts. Here's the main thing to know for the first type of people. Tax collectors, sinners, they were the irreligious, the immoral people of that day. On the other side, second type, Pharisees, teachers of law, scribes, religious leaders of the day. Kind of the opposite. They strictly obeyed this tight Jewish ethical code of conduct for various reasons. And not all of them. Sometimes the Pharisees get a bad rap, but I won't go into it. There's actually good reasons why they wanted to obey God. I mean, it's good to obey God, right? But they were really hyper-focused into it. And they were kind of the elite within the Jewish world. So these are the two types of people that Jesus is interacting with in Luke 15, and actually his whole ministry. Here's the fascinating thing. Who has a bone to pick with Jesus? Is it the irreligious, the immoral people? Or is it the religious people? Which one? Right. First of all, I just find that fascinating. That's just kind of a cultural commentary. Jesus had more problems with the religious people. That's just interesting to think about. One of the biggest problems that he had with the religious people of his day was because he ate with tax collectors and sinners, and in other parts we learn prostitutes. And that was a huge, huge deal in the first century. It would be what's called table fellowship. Here's what eating with someone meant. It wasn't like today where you can have a casual dinner with someone and you meet someone for the first time on business, whatever. No, in the ancient world, who you ate with was who you associated with. It was who you identified with. It was kind of actually, in a sense, a friendly sense of intimacy. So what Jesus is doing when he's eating with tax collectors and sinners is that he's saying, I accept you. I associate with you. And so the religious people, well, that's not in their rule book. And so they begin to grumble and complain and mutter to Jesus. I love how Jesus responds. There's a couple different ways that Jesus could have responded. As I was reading some commentaries, one scholar, I love his imagination. He said this. He said, imagine if Jesus responded this way. And he doesn't, to be clear. But imagine this, because this was a very likely scenario that he could have responded with. So Jesus could have said this, gentlemen, I see that you are upset over my welcome of sinners into table fellowship. This is perfectly reasonable, and I can sympathize with the way that you feel. Ostracization of such types is critical for ceremonial purity. But please understand that for me, such invitations are the exception, not the rule. Furthermore, I insist on welcoming only repentant sinners. And they are always cleaned up before I let them in. And I don't do this often. And it's always in private, away from the eyes of others, so as to prevent any misunderstanding. You will recall, I'm sure, that the God of our tradition is a God of mercy as well as a God of judgment. And we are merely trying to reflect that mercy in our dealings with these unfortunate types. Not how Jesus responds. I mean, he could have come up with this really logical, reasoned defense that they couldn't argue with. But Jesus, he decides to tell some stories. And as we'll find out, here's essentially what Jesus says with his stories. Gentlemen, you accuse me of eating with sinners and tax collectors. You're absolutely correct. That's exactly what I do. And not only do I let them in, but I actually go out into the streets and I shower them with affection and I just urge them to come in and eat with me. Here's the main point for the next month or so. And we're going to look at this parable in so many different ways, but I do think this is the main overall point. This famous parable, it's not about the son. It's about the father who represents God, and it's about the older son who represents the religious people, the Pharisees. In today's world, we would be considered the religious people. This parable is about us. It's about how do we respond to Jesus. And let me provide some clarity. The younger son does symbolize someone as well. He symbolizes the sinners, the tax collectors, the irreligious, the immoral people of the day. And you have both of these sons, and here's the point. They're both lost. The religious one is lost just as much as the lost son. Both of us, whether you're religious or not, you are lost, and we all desperately need Jesus. We all need grace. Not one any more than the other. If anything, though, I do think the irreligious person, the younger son in this story, I do think they're at an advantage, though. Because most people in that category are actually aware that they're lost. And they know they need to go home. The religious people don't, though. And that's a scary situation to be in. So Jesus, he's warming up a little bit. He's going to get to the climax of this chapter, which is the parable of the prodigal father and his two sons. But before he gets there, he shows his cards a little bit with two simple parables. I told you there's two stories before the main one. So we're going to go through them. Luke 15, verse 3. So remember I told you Jesus responds to them with stories. Here's the first story that he tells. Verse 3, then Jesus told him this parable. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and he goes home. And then he calls his friends and his neighbors together and he says, rejoice with me. I have found my lost sheep. I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over just one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. Now, granted, I don't think most of us in this room are shepherds, right? So if you're like me, most people, when they read this parable for the first time, one of the first questions right away is, why in the world would a shepherd leave 99 sheep just for one? I see a couple heads nodding. I mean, it's a totally fair question. Like, the math doesn't add up. Like, 99, 1, why would you risk leaving 99 sheep in the open country just to find one sheep? Now, yeah, I could share with you, okay, well, hey, this is like an agricultural society, and if you owned 100 sheep, that probably meant that you were at least middle income, if not wealthy, meaning you could hire 2 shepherds. You could have one stay with the 99, and you could have the other one go out to find the one. So yes, that's possible. But does Jesus mention that in this parable? He doesn't. I'm of the opinion that he does that on purpose. I think Jesus is making a point. I think he's intentionally making an extreme point. And that's that he will go for just one lost sheep. That's the heart of Jesus. Think of it this way. One scholar told this story. Think of a family of 10 people. And suppose they have dinner every Sunday night, tonight. And so the 10 gather around the dinner table, and they have a little girl. We'll say her name is Ashley. Say Ashley is 3, 4, 5 years old. Now everyone comes to the dinner table, and little Ashley doesn't show up. I mean, can you imagine the dad saying, well, Ashley should know it's Sunday night, it's dinner time, she should be here, she's not. Well, that's her problem, she'll just go hungry. Don't think the dad's probably gonna say that if they're a good father. Do you think the mom would say, well, hey, 9 out of the 10 of us are here, like 90% of us are here. That's a pretty good statistic, so that's good enough, let's just eat. Probably not a good mom if she says that. Okay, what if, like, the whole 9 out of the 10 family members are there, and someone, hey, we need to go find Ashley, and someone's like, well, no, who cares? Let's just eat now. She doesn't need to be here. Probably not good siblings. I mean, can you imagine if 2 months later, time goes by, everyone's at the dinner table, and someone just kind of pipes up, oh yeah, do you remember when Ashley was a member of our family? I mean, that's all nonsense to us, right? If you're in a good, healthy family, unless like your mom is making you eat vegetables or something like that. And I remember those days. But here's the point. Jesus, I mean, it doesn't matter if there are 2 shepherds. I don't care if that is true. The point is that Jesus goes after the one. And you got to know here that sheep are extremely dumb animals. Like, I'm not making this up. This isn't a joke. Sheep are from my understanding, some of the most stupid animals alive. So if you lose like your cat or your dog, and some of your hearts are like, oh, I don't even want to think about that. Well, sometimes, I heard this story in the news like 2 weeks ago. If you lose your cat, your dog, sometimes they may come back in a couple days or a week. I think there was a house, in the Santa Barbara area, they had the fire, and their dog they thought it was killed. And the dog came back like 2 weeks later. Just this remarkable story. Okay, sheep. Sheep are so dumb that even if you find a sheep, the sheep will not think to follow you back. So, if this happened, the shepherd would have to pick up a sheep, put him on his shoulders, and walk him home. You notice that Jesus says that the shepherd joyfully put the sheep on his shepherds and walked home. By the way, sheep can weigh 70 pounds. Next story, verse 8. The second story leading up to the famous parable. Jesus says this, or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Does she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and her neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin. In the same way I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God, even over just one sinner. One sheep, one coin, one sinner who repents. Pretty straightforward picture, right? Here's a story of a lady. She's in her house. She probably has what's a cash box, and it has 10 coins in there. These aren't like video game arcade tokens. This isn't like your penny collection, you know. No, each coin in here is worth a day's wage. So maybe there's around $1,000 in there. And so she loses a coin. And so she does everything she can. We think this is probably a lower income household because she doesn't have any windows. And she finds it, and she's just so full of joy. And she's like, I found it. I got to tell everyone. I mean, this is worth celebrating. Jesus is saying to the religious people of his day, why are you grumbling and complaining and muttering when all I want to do is I'm just here to seek and save the lost? And in fact, he says, there is nothing that brings me more joy than throwing a party for a socially despised person when they come back home to their maker. Really what Jesus is saying to them is, why don't you stop bickering and why don't you actually do what I'm doing? Ouch. Like that wasn't a sentimental Hallmark storytime message that Jesus is giving. And hopefully you see the contrast that he's making. Religious people, angry, bitter, muttering, complaining to Jesus. Jesus, full of joy, throwing parties, eating with everyone. Big contrast. Now for me, as I said, I grew up in the church. I've heard a lot of these parables before. It's easy for me to read them, to study them. Oh, yeah, I get it. You know, abstractly, I get the point that Jesus is making. Makes sense. But I think that I have, and many others have, and we've kind of sanitized the Bible. We get used to it. It kind of loses its punch to us. The thing is, Jesus was an incredibly radical, subversive person. I think most of us miss the pulse of what he's getting at here. I did, until about a month and a half ago, I lost something too. So a little story time here. And it's funny, when this happened, my first thought was like, ooh, this is gonna be in a sermon, this will be good. That's like a preacher's life. So a month and a half ago, a couple days after Christmas, me, Rachel, my wife, and then her mom and her brother, we go up to Central California, and we're in kind of roughly Pismo Beach, San Luis Obispo area, and we go on this beautiful hike, just right on the ocean. If you've ever been to Montana Day Oral State Park, that's where we're at. Just beautiful trees. We're walking literally just on the edge of like ocean bluffs, clear blue water crashing over rocks. It's awesome. And so we go on about a 45-minute hike. And so towards the end of it, we're walking back toward our car, and I do this. I put my hands in my pockets, and I realize, wait, there's nothing in there. And so I kind of do it again, even though I already know there's something in there, but I kind of like want to mentally reassure myself. And no, there's nothing in there. Well, when we started the hike, you know, the keys were in my pocket. And so a couple things began to go through my head. Okay, Mark, your car key was the only car key that you brought up on this trip. You are more than 4 hours away from home. You were standing near a bluff. of which the ocean is down there. Is your key right now in the Pacific Ocean? I'm internally processing all this before I say anything out loud. So then I look over to Rachel, Craig, my brother-in-law, Beth, my mother-in-law, and I say, hey, do you guys have the keys? I get a bunch of blank stares. And they're like, no. Like, oh, well, neither do I. And one thing you got to know about this is my brother-in-law Craig, he's a little bit of a prankster. And so I know this about him, and so does Rachel and her mom. And so we look at Craig, I'm like, Craig, bro, I know you have the key, like, nice try. You know what I mean? Like, I caught you. You tried to pull a fast one on us. Like, yeah, just give us the key now. And he's like, no, I don't have it, seriously. I'm like, no, I knew you were going to say that, so just give me the key. Like, it's daylight starting to go out at this point. He's like, no, I don't have it. Okay, and so at this point, I'm starting to think a couple more thoughts. One, Rachel's never going to let this down on me because she already thinks I misplace my wallet and my keys a lot. Never lose them, but I just misplace them. All right, husbands, you're like, yeah, I know what that's like. And then, so I'm thinking that, and then I'm thinking, well, how do I solve this? Okay, I can call AAA, but no, AAA probably can't fix this. It's not like a dead battery or a flat tire or, you know, the key's not inside the car. We don't know where the key is. Okay, what if I go to like a local Toyota dealership? Like maybe they can make a new key for us. You know, I'm sure there's a Toyota dealership in San Luis Obispo. But then I'm like, well, no, that can't be the case because couldn't anybody do that to steal a car? They could just say like, oh yeah, that's my car, and I lost my key, and so I need you to make a new one, and somehow they work it out. I'm like, so no, that can't be possible either. So I'm like, okay. So at this point, we're pretty close to the car. We've looked underground. Maybe it just got dropped right when I opened the door, you know, whatever. No key. And at this point, I'm still like, Craig has the key. You know what I mean? Like, I'm still convinced Craig has the key. And so I look at Craig, and Craig's just kind of sitting there or standing there, and I see him jiggle his hands in his pockets. And I'm like, I got you. And right when I see him, his hands jiggling in his pockets, I hear the car beep noise, like the beep, beep. And I hear it again, and then you see the lights flash. It's our car. And I'm like, Craig, bro, I knew you had it. See, like you didn't get me. He's like, no, I seriously don't have it. And I look at Rachel. I'm like, Rachel, maybe you're trying to pull a prank on us. Like, I don't know. Like, did you hide the key in the bushes? And she, no, I don't have it. And then this random guy walks up. And he says, hey, I was waiting for you guys. So we found this key on the trail somewhere. And we didn't know whose it was, obviously, so I just picked it up. We went all the way back, and we just wanted to wait for you to get back to give it to you. I was going to leave you a note on the windshield, but you just happened to show up, so here you go. I mean, we went from like a stress level 1 to 10. We were like a 13. Everyone went down to like 2. I was still like at an 8 because I still knew Rachel was going to be mad at me for losing the key. You know what I'm saying? So, you know what it was too? It wasn't even my fault. No. So I always keep keys in my pocket. Now check this out. And I use her keys. Her keys have like the rock climbing thing, a little clip on that you put on, you know, to the bell thing. And that's what fell off. So I'm like, that's not even my keychain. Like that, your thing needs to get fixed, not mine. So, I mean, we're just so full of joy. We're so thankful. I mean, just a little thing like that, the disaster that it creates. And so as we're driving out a couple miles, we're thinking like, oh my gosh, like this guy could have stolen our car. Like we are so grateful. We're so happy. We're so full of joy. And we're like, what else is there if we lost? We'd be so worried about. Most people are like, you know, oh yeah, our house keys or whatever. And me and Rachel are like, the worst thing for us would be if we lost our 11-pound Chihuahua. You know what I mean? Like that'd be the worst thing for us. And so this past week, I'm thinking about that story and it hits me. If I get that passionate over losing a car key, if I get that worried over losing our little Tessa, and I think about the joy that it would bring us if we found her and the joy that it brought us for finding the key, how much more joy does Jesus have when a human being who is lost comes home? Right? How much more? And so this was a heart check for me. And I hope it's a heart check for us, individually as well as a church. And so here's the question I wanted for us this morning. Are we willing to do whatever it takes? And whatever it takes would be the main phrase there, to help someone lost come back home to their Maker. Do we want to participate in like the joyful divine parties of heaven and just rejoice, even if it's just one person? Or are we going to be a bunch of buzzkills, party poopers? We're going to be like the religious people in this story, the older brother in the parable that we're going to read about, and we're just going to sit there and we're going to be angry and we're going to be frustrated and we're just going to negative attitude. Yes, two choices. Just like there's two types of people, there's two ways to respond to Jesus here. Guys, I got like 20 more minutes. Oh. I'm just joking. No, that's not true. I'm just joking. Like 5-7 more. But give me some of that cool background music. It feels good. So I want to get real practical with you guys now. I want to get real practical. I want you to ask yourself this. Do you feel inconvenienced? Do you have a tendency to judge other people who you think don't deserve God's grace like you do? Seriously. Inside, like you're not going to say it out loud, right? But internally, this is what you're thinking. Because here, let me say this. If that's the way you react, here's what that means. It means that you really think, contrary to what you say theologically, that you think someone is saved by what they do and not by the free grace of God in Jesus Christ. When you're around someone who doesn't live up to your standards, how do you feel inside? Because I think really what a religious person is tempted to believe is that, oh, you know what? God loves me because of my righteousness, because I go to church, because I tithe, because I do all these good things. That's why he loves me, and that's why that person's not in church and a Christian. The problem with that is who's to say what's good enough? Who's to say that your standard of judgment is right? How many good things do you have to do? We all need grace. So I think the litmus test, the practical application for this, if we really believe that we are saved by grace alone through faith alone, I'm not talking theologically, we all say that, I'm talking about your lifestyle. Here's the thing. If you really believe in grace, you will live offensively. Let me say that again. If you really believe in grace, you will live offensively. If you really believe in the scandalous grace of God, you will live a scandalous life, just like Jesus. Jesus was scandalous. Religious people did not like him. So the question for us this morning is, what do we have to do to ignite the same response from religious people in our day? Isn't that an interesting question? What do we have to do today to ignite the same response that Jesus got from religious people today? I think a lot of us, we're good church people. That's who we hang out with. We perceive ourselves as being cleaned up. No one in your circle thinks that they need grace. because everyone is kind of good, and yeah, we live by good ethical principles. You're just as messed up. I'm just as messed up. We become numb to our need for grace. So what if? What if a gay couple walked in here and joined us for our worship service? What's your reaction to that? Not what you would say out loud, but what you're thinking inside. What if homeless people came in here? You know, heaven forbid, people came in here full sleeves of tattoos, tank top on, got a hat on. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. But I know, I've seen some of the reactions of people inside this church to people who are dressed that way. Grace is offensive. I want to be like Jesus. I don't say that self-righteously, but what I mean by that is the more I get to know Jesus, the more radical and subversive he is, and I want to be like that. Here, you know what my challenge for me this morning is? My personal thing is, Mark, you need to live more offensively. I want to be accused more by Christians. Not just because I want to get accused or I'm trying to be offensive, but because I want to showcase the grace of God so much that I want Christians telling me, why are you hanging out with those people? Why are they here? I know I'm following Jesus when I get that answer. So response time. As Juno mentioned, we're in the Lenten season. So there's a cross back there that you can write your sins on, what you're giving up for Lent this year. We have communion right here that you can take. Man, what a better declaration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Jesus doesn't say, clean up and come follow me. He says, come follow me up, come follow me and I'll clean you up. We have candles over here to light, signifying the grace of God penetrating a dark place. And then we're going to sing a song right now, Reckless Love. And if you listen and you see the words, I mean, that actually speaks of this parable of the shepherd going after the one. And if you're here and you are lost this morning, I want you to know that Jesus Christ he is pursuing you with all he can, and he wants his love to flow down on you. And the same thing if you're a religious Christian in here. Jesus' love is reckless for you. There's not one thing that you can do to earn it. And so I would just encourage you to stand, to put your arms out, to get on your knees, but just to respond to God's reckless love this morning. We're going to have the ushers come forward now. They're going to take our offering. We do that here at New Life because money is not our God. The money's his, and we give it back to him. So let's respond as a church together now.